You can hardly open a newspaper at the moment without being accosted by amazing assertions and health claims for something which are called polyphenols. From a craft chocolate perspective, this is music to our ears because craft chocolate has more polyphenols than just about anything else on the planet. There's going to be a longer set of mini videos which try and explain to you first and foremost what polyphenols are, then secondly why they have all these wonderful health claims for them, thirdly what is it about chocolate and polyphenols, what do you need to look for? And then fourthly, why is it that you should really focus on craft chocolate? And how is it that your sense of flavour can actually help you identify whether or not the polyphenols are still in the chocolate? But if that's all too much, here's the bottom line. Polyphenols, otherwise at one point known as vitamin P, are basically antioxidants. They're phytonutrients which you get in lots of plants, lots of drinks, and in particular in dark chocolate. There's nothing which has got more polyphenols in it than actually a great dark chocolate. But the trick to getting all the benefits from these antioxidants, these anti-inflammatory agents, etc., is whether or not the chocolate has been properly crafted. Because what you don't want is a bar that's been overheated, and you don't want a bar that's been over-alkalized. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to get that information by just reading the label. So what you need to do is learn to savour and identify through your sense of flavour and your palate whether or not the bar's been over roasted, whether or not it's been alkalized, and you're looking for blick. If a bar has got balance, length, intensity, complexity, and you just want to savour it, and it's a craft chocolate bar, it's going to be bursting with polyphenols. Everything else, forget it. So let's try and explain to you what polyphenols are and where they emerge. So we've actually known about polyphenols for eons. That's because tannins, which we use for everything from like tanning leather to creating ink, are a form of polyphenols. But it was basically in the 19th century that people started to work out what polyphenols were actually doing and how they were working. And essentially what they are is phytonutrients inside plants which are complicated molecules which have all sorts of health benefits. They also give flavour and some astringency and some bitterness to the foods. And one of the theories that we have around them is that actually the reason why we have a sense of flavour is so that we can identify plants which are full of polyphenols and other phytonutrients. So that's essentially what a polyphenol is. It's a complicated way of saying this has got lots of antioxidants. There are lots of different sorts of polyphenols. So in particular case, chocolate has got something which are called flavonols, and then something called epicatechins. Different foods have got different forms of polyphenols, but essentially they're complex molecules, that's why they're poly and phenols, which are created by the plant as it works with the soil. Let's talk a bit about the health claims for polyphenols. These are really complicated. I'm not a doctor, I'm not a nutritional expert. I've read as much as I possibly can about it. And here's sort of where I've got to on it. So polyphenols have been identified since the 19th century. At one point, the people who discovered them actually claimed there was a vitamin P, P for polyphenols. In the end, this was basically watered down a bit, and the argument for it being watered down is not that polyphenols aren't necessarily healthy and good for you. It's that unlike other vitamins like vitamin C or vitamin D, which clearly have direct relationships with specific problems like scurvy with vitamin C or rickets, for example, vitamin P polyphenols have multiple benefits, and it's quite complicated in the way in which they interact. So for example, some of the claims which you're going to get are around how they moderate blood sugar levels, how they help your gut health. Then it gets a bit more controversial with antioxidant claims, with all sorts of claims around cancer, also claims around heart health. The problem here is, I think, twofold. There's one which is it's incredibly complicated, and the actual foods that we eat as well. There are a lot of things, when we talk about chocolate, you're going to see this. There are a lot of things which impact the amount of polyphenol, so it's difficult to figure out what's going on. And then secondly, individuals' guts react differently to different forms of polyphenols. So the actual health benefits to polyphenols, I think, are definitely there, but they're very complicated to unwind, and they're very individual to products and to you personally. Now let's talk a little bit about how chocolate is amazingly high in polyphenols, but also what drives those polyphenols, what enhances them, and also what destroys them. So there are lots of foods which are very high in polyphenols, blueberries for example, but nothing really beats chocolate. Chocolate just has a whopping amount of polyphenols inside it. In particular, it's got flavonols, and it's also got something called epicatechins. However, there are two things that you need to really bear aware of when you think about polyphenols in chocolate. One of which is actually how much chocolate is there. So unfortunately, white chocolate, milk chocolate, especially confectionery, there's not going to be many polyphenols on that. Secondly, and much more complicated and much more difficult to get your head around, is what is it which actually determines how much polyphenols get left in the chocolate bar that you've got. And there are two very, very important byproduct of the way that mass-produced chocolate, ultra-processed chocolate is made, which destroys the polyphenols. The first is called alkalization. So if you buy in particular cocoa powder or cooking powder and things like that, it's probably been washed in an alkali bath. If that happens, you've destroyed all the polyphenols as well as lots of the other health benefits too. So there'll be no magnesium. Nothing else like that. So that's the first thing. The second thing, which is actually much more complicated to understand, because generally you can figure out if something's been Dutched or alkalized or not. It will perhaps say on the label and you can sort of query them. But the next category is much more difficult, which is actually the way in which the chocolate has been grown, the soil it's been grown in and how it's been looked after, what fertilizers, what pesticides have been got, and then how it's actually been crafted and processed. Because if you craft and process it by using lots of heat, you destroy all the polyphenols. Unfortunately, outside of the craft chocolate world, nobody will tell you actually how they process their chocolate, and most of the time they won't even tell you actually where they're getting the chocolate from, so you don't know where the beans are from and how it's been fermented. But in the last section, in section 4, we're going to tell you a little bit about how you can identify this. So generally, the advice to identify whether or not food is good or not is to look at the ingredients and look at the packaging and all that sort of stuff. And this is an important first step. Unfortunately, when you're looking at polyphenols, it's a little bit more complicated. Yes, you can tell whether it's a milk or a dark chocolate, so that's a first step. But actually, what you really need to understand is, has it been alkalized? And then what temperatures has it been roasted to? And how have the beans been treated in the soil? So is the soil healthy? Has it had fertilizers and pesticides? It's very difficult to get this information. There's a little bit you can get if you trawl through the patterns of how big chocolate processes its chocolate, and we've done that. And so we know that, for example, if you heat the beans as a form of cleaning them or as a form of preparing them for roasting, that can destroy the polyphenols. Similarly, a lot of mass-produced chocolate is nib roasted, and it's roasted at a very high temperature. And once you get above a certain temperature, the epicatechins, which is the main form of polyphenol inside chocolate, dramatically falls down. Okay, so what can you do about this? Practically, I think this is the great argument for using your palate. Because if you can get a chocolate which has got a nice flavor, if it's got some balance, if it's got some length, if it's got some intensity and some complexity, then you know that it won't have been over roasted. And you also know that it won't have been grown in rubbish soil with loads of fertilizers and pesticides, because if it has been, that will destroy all the flavor. And flavors, remember what we talked about, how polyphenols work. Polyphenols, the phytonutrients, that's what gives the chocolate or the wine or the tea its flavor. So again, use your palate, learn to appreciate craft chocolate, and you will basically be getting an amazing polyphenol boost.